What I'd like to do today is reflect a little on how we might judge whether we're actually succeeding when we're engaged in the metaphysics of science. In other words, given the aims of this part of philosophy, what parameters might we assess to determine whether we're actually succeeding in doing what we're hoping to do? So as an aside, just for the purposes of today, I'm just going to treat metaphysics of science as synonymous with naturalized metaphysics or scientific metaphysics. Of course, in order to determine whether we're succeeding in realizing our aims, we need to know what those aims are. And it's probably safe to say that not everyone has precisely the same aims in mind when it comes to the metaphysics of science. I mean, everyone agrees that it's in some way tethered to science, but then we might disagree about the exact or proper nature of this tethering, right? And thus what the aim is exactly. So maybe it's to give an interpretation of the content of scientific theories and models. Or perhaps it's to give a deeper or more fulsome elaboration, right, of those things. Or perhaps it's even to add something complementary to that content. For today, I'm not going to say much about how precisely we might understand the nature of the tethering relationship between science and the metaphysics of science. But I do want to make an assumption as a starting point about another sort of disagreement about aims. You might wonder whether the aim of the metaphysics of science is epistemic or not. Is the point of it to tell us something about the world? Right? I mean, these days, philosophers generally agree that the aim of science is epistemic, right? And even that our best theories and models are successful in achieving that aim. Of course, there's a lot of variance about how exactly science succeeds epistemically. As we know, that issue is contested by different versions of instrumentalism, different versions of scientific realism, and so on. But at least all of those different sorts of people think that science is an epistemic project. The goal is knowledge, and more specifically, knowledge of the actual world. On the other hand, when it comes to the metaphysics of science, there isn't really the same sort of consensus. So for example, even leaving aside people who are allergic to metaphysics, right? We all have empiricist or pragmatist-minded friends or frenemies, right, who think that at best, a reasonable conception of its aim isn't that it's to describe the way the world is, right, as opposed to describing the way it might be or could be. On that understanding, these things are, there are things that are epistemically warranted, like certain scientific claims. And then there's the metaphysics of science that speculates further and explores a kind of possibility space of finer grained or more fundamental or more general ways those epistemically warranted things could be. So perhaps we have epistemically warranted facts about, say, quantum phenomena as described by our best physics. And then we have some metaphysics of science, say in the form of interpretations of quantum mechanics that are attempts to flesh out the way the world could or might be given the scientifically warranted facts. On that conception of the metaphysics of science, the bar for success is low, right? Because there's nothing epistemic at stake. It might just be a fun thing to do. Or on some occasions, it might even be a useful thing to do, right? In just the way imagined by a number of people historically, Quine, Popper, many others. Right? You might think of it as a kind of exercise that, who knows, might eventually be co-opted for scientific purposes, like when theorizing about natural kinds is ultimately followed one day by scientific investigations of certain categories of things. Or say when a purely formal exercise, like the derivation of the Bell inequalities, is ultimately followed one day by empirical investigation, as in the aspect experiments that demonstrated that they're violated. If you think that sometimes the metaphysics of science is valuable that way, it's not because it has epistemic warrant per se, because on that view, warrant only accrues when empirical investigation kicks in. As a starting point today, I want to make the opposite assumption, Right? I want to make the assumption that the aim of the metaphysics of science is epistemic. In other words, that the point of doing it is to tell us something substantive about the way the world is, right? The way, what it's like, right? Not merely possibly, but actually. On this conception of the aim, the idea is something like the following. Given that science is in some way epistemically successful, and because of the way the metaphysics of science is tethered to science, the metaphysics of science is also epistemically successful, right? So epistemic warrant of science, appropriate tethering, hence epistemic warrant of metaphysics. Now, a lot of us are interested in and have been exploring, right, exactly what I've just described, though not usually put in quite those terms. The reason I've been describing this in terms of aims and success conditions and epistemic warrant is that I want to focus our minds very specifically on the question of how we actually assess warrant. In hypotheses, theories, claims, and so on gain warrant via confirmation. So I want to approach the question of how we should think about whether the metaphysics of science, conceived of as an epistemic project, can be successful or not through the lens of how we think about confirmation. And what I'm going to suggest is that if we do that, as folks who are naturally inclined, then we should approach it in exactly the same way we do in cases of science, which is to say that it doesn't really make sense to talk about whether a field of inquiry, like science or the metaphysics of science, has epistemic warrant. Rather, just in the way that we think that any given proposition have higher or lower degrees of confirmation, specific hypotheses or theories or claims can have higher or lower degrees of confirmation and thus warrant. After that, whether you believe it or not just depends on the degrees of confirmation you require in order to form sufficiently high degrees of belief. So if we really want to determine whether any particular aspect of the metaphysics of science has warrant or not, we should do exactly what we do in the case of different aspects of science, which is to think about the strength of the relevant confirmation and whether it's good enough to produce warrant for belief. Okay, so time is short. I'm going to focus on two ways in which we might do this. I'm not suggesting that they're exhaustive, right? But they're obvious starting points and have been engaged in various ways by people, including many of you already, so we have a head start. The first way concerns how we think about confirmation flowing from empirical testing. And the second concerns how we think about confirmation flowing from explanatory considerations. The ideas of empirical testing and explanatory considerations aren't mutually exclusive, of course. But I think that they sometimes come apart, so I'm going to discuss them separately. Some of this I'm going to draw from one of the books that Thomas mentioned that came out a few years ago. Actually, the paperback just came out earlier this year. Some of what I'm going to say draws on some replies to some commentaries since then. So Amanda, who I think is out there somewhere, wrote one of them. Some of it I'm just making up now, right? So trying to go a little bit further. The book is called Scientific Ontology, and it's basically about naturalized metaphysics and the epistemology of the metaphysics of science. Okay, so first, confirmation and empirical testing. One immediate impact of thinking about these issues in terms of confirmation is that the distinction we sometimes operate with in this domain, in this arena, the distinction between science and metaphysics, with science on the epistemically virtuous side and analytic metaphysics on the epistemically unvirtuous side, and then hopefully the metaphysics of science somewhere in between, right? Hopefully more like the former than the latter. I think that's a suspicious way of setting up the discussion. From the point of view of confirmation, merely being science doesn't carry any weight all by itself. It carries weight only insofar as some relevant parts of science are well confirmed. And for almost everyone, right, these days, if not historically, empirical testing is especially weighty for confirmation. So this is obvious, I think, in debates about scientific realism. A lot of versions of what these days we often call selective realism say things like, sure, There are ways in which our best theories are likely false. There are ways in which they may be radically revised in the fullness of time, etc. But some parts are very well confirmed by means of empirical testing, and we're warranted in believing those parts. But recognizing a link between confirmation and empirical testing is one thing. Actually assessing what's confirmed in any given empirical test and to what extent, well, that's another thing. And it's often not very easy to work out. So imagine that you're a physicist in the late 17th century and you're discussing Newton's account of gravitation, say with one of your colleagues. You both think that the theory passes some very impressive empirical tests, but you think that this confirms to some impressive degree the existence of gravitational forces. Your friend, on the other hand, thinks that the confirmational weight of the evidence doesn't take you quite that far. So they're agnostic about forces per se. People were divided about this sort of thing after the Principia. Or take much more recent cases of empirical detection. So the neutrino was posited by Fermi and Pauli in the 1930s, right? Not on a whim, but for empirical reasons, right? To allow for conservation of mass energy and angular momentum in certain processes of atomic decay. In other words, there were empirical detections of those quantities going missing in certain interactions, and the neutrino filled the gap. But the experiments by Raines and Cowan to actually detect neutrinos themselves, they didn't occur for another 20 years, right, in the 1950s. And you could tell, I think, a similar story about the positing of the Higgs boson in 1964, right? Again, not as a flight of fancy, but for empirical reasons. And the detection announcement by CERN, which didn't come until 2012. So what's the point of these examples? Well, I want to extract 2 points. The first is that taking science to be empirical or a posteriori, and taking metaphysics to be non-empirical or a priori is too simple a way of setting up the discussion, and thus a potentially misleading way to proceed. I mean, even if you're a confirmational holist and think that all of the parts of a theory inherit some degree of confirmation in light of empirical evidence, the empirical evidence with which it's compatible, that doesn't entail that everything in a theory is confirmed by empirical evidence to the same degree. Even if some or many confirmational holists wouldn't put it quite this way, they nonetheless behave that way in the sense that they're apt to regard some commitments as more or less revisable than others in the face of recalcitrant empirical evidence. So in the book, I call this empirical vulnerability, right? It concerns how susceptible a theory or claim is to empirical testing. I think of it as being related to, but actually different than Popper's notion of falsifiability, in part because he takes falsifiability to be a sine qua non of what it is to count as science. And I don't think that's a very clear or even sensible understanding of all of what we call science. Now, insofar as we're concerned with warrant and confirmation, the empirical vulnerability of, say, a proposition is something that's assessed on the basis of our actual empirical evidence. In other words, it's about current warrant, not about possible or potential or prospective warrant. So when we imagine that one day it might be possible to conduct experiments that give us empirical evidence to weigh in definitively on debates between different interpretations of quantum mechanics, in just the same way that it became possible to conduct experiments to weigh in definitively on the Bell inequalities, that isn't relevant to empirical vulnerability now, right? So it isn't relevant to warrant now. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. In fact, it may be a great idea, right? It's just that this kind of imagined possible success doesn't support the conception of the aim of the metaphysics of science I started out with, which was to give descriptions of the world that have epistemic warrant. It may support a different conception of the aims. So that was the first point that I wanted to extract. The empirical, non-empirical distinction is too simple. On the other hand, we can add the appropriate nuance by talking about the relevance of empirical vulnerability to confirmation. The second point that I want to extract is this. empirical vulnerability isn't plausibly conceived as a bivalent property. It isn't as though, in light of empirical evidence, a given part of a theory is either vulnerable or invulnerable. Rather, empirical vulnerability is something that admits of degrees. That's why the sorts of cases I mentioned just a moment ago, like the existence of neutrinos or bosons at different stages of empirical inquiry, are so interesting, right? Because the extent of the empirical vulnerability of those posits and judgments about how tight the connection between those posits and the specific empirical tests needed to be in order to warrant belief, that was all up for grabs. Okay, let's move on now and talk about another thing that's relevant to thinking about conformational strength, namely how it may or may not flow from explanatory considerations and how this bears on epistemic warrant. As I mentioned earlier, the relevance of empirical testing and the relevance of explanatory considerations aren't mutually exclusive things. After all, the conformational boost that something gets for being implicated in a successful empirical test can be described in terms of explanation. We sometimes say that the fact that something exists or that it has a specific nature or specific properties explains or partially explains why an empirical test was successful. But I think it makes sense to take explanation to be an importantly relevant thing in its own right for two reasons. For one thing, if you think about explanations generally, it seems clear that not all of them are about explaining the results of empirical tests. So the potential relevance of explanatory considerations is arguably broader than that. I'll mention some examples in a moment so you can see what I have in mind. Another reason for discussing explanations separately from empirical testing is this: how we assess the conformational weight of explanatory considerations is especially relevant, I think, to the distinction between the metaphysics of science and the rest of metaphysics, if indeed it's possible to make that distinction at all. So let me start by making an analogous claim to the one I made about how distinguishing between the epistemic virtues of science and metaphysics on the basis of the empirical, non-empirical distinction is too coarse, that we need to be more fine-grained about it. I want to say something similar about explanation. I actually think that explanatory considerations are ubiquitous determinants of what we believe, at least upon reflection. But at that level of abstraction, we really aren't saying much, because it's the strength of specific explanations in specific contexts that's relevant to confirmation, right? Not the abstract idea of explanation. And this point, I think, has been nicely raised by a number of people in recent papers by Ladyman, Satsi, Morganti, and Taco raised this in a paper they wrote relatively recently. The target here is a claim by many metaphysicians who say, hey, scientists use inference to the best explanation, and so do metaphysicians. So if science is epistemically warranted, then so is metaphysics. But just as warrant isn't generated merely as a function of being science, it likewise isn't generated merely as a function of being explanatory. There are different kinds of explanations, and in a given context, different explanatory virtues may be more or less relevant, which means that their presence or absence may be more or less relevant to confirmation. We've already had one example of how explanatory considerations can generate warrant, right? That's in the case of empirical tests. The relevant explanations there tend to be causal explanations. In those contexts, we might consider how central or important a given aspect of a theory is to that sort of explanation. Let's consider some different cases. So one class of examples that might qualify as falling under the heading of the metaphysics of science are metaphysical assumptions or presuppositions of our best science. So some examples came up in Will's talk about what he was calling the metaphysics latenness of observation. Some came up in Al's talk. A given domain of scientific inquiry may assume a framework of, say, ontological categories, and then describe the relevant phenomena in those terms. More generally, The idea is that certain concepts or principles are assumed as part of the background we need to have in place before it's even possible to engage in any sort of investigation at all. So you might say that, say, Euclidean geometry as a means by which to describe spatial relations is presuppositional for Newtonian physics. Or that the idea that the speed of light is the same in all directions is presuppositional for Einstein's formulation of special relativity. These kinds of assumptions or presumptions are difficult to characterize as outputs of empirical investigation in any direct way. But they're necessary as a part of the investigative foundation that allows relevant scientific theorizing and experimenting to get off the ground. So in that sense, they form part of an overall explanation of the empirical success of a theory. But not because they're things that can be isolated and detected, right, in the way that we think we can isolate other theoretical things like neutrinos in terms of some sort of causal manipulation or intervention. Here's another example. Consider debates about the metaphysics of biological species. What is a species exactly? Is it something you might describe as belonging to the metaphysical tradition of theorizing about natural kinds? Right? In other words, a category of things made up of members who share a property or properties, right? The sharing of which is definitive of the kind. Or is it, say, an individual that comes into existence during a speciation event and then goes out of existence with extinction? Well, if species are individuals, then any given organism associated with it isn't a member per se, right, but rather a part, which suggests a different sort of mereological relationship and, interestingly, different metaphysical consequences. Those are just two ways of thinking about species, right? And clearly I'm not going to do justice to debates about various concepts of them here. The point of mentioning them is that in any given case, the proposal as to what a species is offered to make sense of the way that biologists think about species, how they evolve, what relations their constituents have with one another, their relations to other species, and so on. As such, they're parts of explanations of the overall coherence of a particular area of scientific inquiry. But that sort of explanation is even less directly connected, right, to the causally detectable aspects of the relevant phenomena than metaphysical assumptions and presuppositions. And yet, they're clearly intended to explain the nature of species. So in the book, I talk about the connection between explanatory considerations and epistemic warrant in terms of what I call explanatory power. So abstractly, it's a measure of how well a metaphysical hypothesis or theory exemplifies criteria that are typically associated with good explanations, right? So you're all familiar with these things, right? Internal consistency, simplicity, coherence with background knowledge, the unification of otherwise disparate phenomena. But that's speaking abstractly, right? In practice, different interpretations and weightings of the usual criteria depend on the context. And most importantly, the question of whether any particular sort of explanation, right, so I gave some examples a moment ago, are relevant to confirmation and thus warrant is hugely contested. And that's before we even start to argue about how well a given sort of explanation would have to score with respect to those explanatory virtues before they actually contribute to genuine confirmation. So, as others have argued in various and different ways, saying that the metaphysics of science or that metaphysics impliciter share a method with science, just like the empirical, non-empirical distinction, is too simple, right? Concrete explanations exemplify abstract slogans like inference to the best explanation in different ways. And whether they have any import for confirmation and how much import they have is something that has to be assessed contextually. And just like empirical vulnerability, explanatory power isn't plausibly conceived of as a bivalent property of explanations. It's something that admits of degrees. Okay, so let me draw some morals here for thinking about the methodology of the metaphysics of science. Given an epistemic conception of it, according to which the aim of the game is to give us knowledge, right? And more specifically, knowledge of the actual world. The upshot of what I've said so far is that if we're interested in warrant for belief, then general appeals to the idea of being connected in some way to empirical testing or being explanatory aren't going to help us very much. We need to look at the details. And when we do that, what we find is that features that are relevant to warranting belief, like connectedness to empirical inquiry, right? That is empirical vulnerability, and the compellingness of good explanations, right? That's explanatory power, are things that admit of degrees. And this brings me finally to the big M and the small m of my title. I take it that when some philosophers interested in the metaphysics of science conceive of it as having epistemic aims that stand some chance of being fulfilled, they're making a distinction between the metaphysics of science, right, which stands that chance, and some other sort of metaphysics, which has a snowball's chance in Florida. What we see when we see how indicators of possible warrant admit of degrees of confirmation, we can diagnose what they're doing, I think, this way, right? They're identifying some cases of metaphysics as being sufficiently confirmed to be taken seriously and dismissing others as being insufficiently confirmed. The metaphysics of science, in virtue of whatever tethering relationship to science is specified, has sufficient warrant, right? So that's small m metaphysics. It's connected to science in the right sort of way. Big M metaphysics, sadly, right, lacking that sort of tether, doesn't take confirmation seriously enough, so it has insufficient warrant. The methodological point that I want to make here regarding the metaphysics of science is that I'm not sure we've thought carefully enough about confirmation. I don't think we've argued very explicitly, or even at all, most of the time, for the idea that the specific instances of the metaphysics of science in which we're engaged have sufficient empirical vulnerability or explanatory power to support an epistemic aim. I'm not saying it's impossible, right? On the contrary. But I am saying that if you have an epistemic conception of the metaphysics of science, and you're doing some metaphysics that's ostensibly metaphysics of science, then an articulation of why exactly we should think that that particular instance of metaphysics scores well with respect to confirmation is probably worth thinking about. I think that task has actually become more difficult over the past century because a lot of what was once viewed as metaphysics is now accepted by most people as not being metaphysical at all, right? Precisely because it's seen as an inquiry that can be viewed reasonably as susceptible to confirmation. So during the heyday of logical empiricism, talking about the ontology of things that are undetectable by the unaided human senses, that was metaphysics. And needless to say, metaphysics wasn't something that was amenable to confirmation. But today, constructive empiricists, as per Bas van Fraassen, don't think that believing in atoms or proteins is metaphysics. And they even think that we can rationally believe in those things, right? Even if they also think that it's perfectly rational not to believe in them. So the line separating what most people would qualify as metaphysics has shifted in a way that makes it harder, I think, to distinguish between the metaphysics of science and other metaphysics. Because a lot of the low-hanging fruit, right, like the existence of unobservable entities that we can detect by putatively reliable causal manipulations and interventions, that isn't really viewed as metaphysical anymore. And that means that what most of us think of as falling under the heading of the metaphysics of science involves connections to empirical science that are much, much weaker, right, from the point of view of confirmation than things that can be putatively demonstrated causally and experimentally. So let me just end with a challenge, really, for all of us. As you know, scientific papers generally have a methods section. Among other things, the function of it is to convince the reader by detailing how the evidence was collected and analyzed, that the results of the paper have plausible epistemic warrant. Now, philosophy papers don't have method sections, and when we do talk about it, it's often in these very abstract terms of the empirical versus the non-empirical, or of giving explanations. What I'm suggesting is that whether explicitly or just in the privacy of your own study, right, when we're in our own corners of the metaphysics of science, I'm suggesting that we consider the issue of confirmation in that context. We probably aren't making novel predictions. Well, Al said that he made one, right? But we probably aren't doing that very much. So the epistemic warrant is going to have to derive from other things. How closely is the hypothesis or theory connected to empirical aspects of the science? I'm not sure a lot of metaphysics of science takes that very seriously. Could the relevant bit of metaphysics be replaced by a contrary hypothesis or theory that would do pretty much the same work, right, functionally speaking? I mean, in terms of accounting for something, explanatorily. How seriously underdetermined is it by the empirical aspects of the science? Presumably, that sort of analysis of epistemic warrant will leave us with lower credences, which is fine, right, in our metaphysics of science hypotheses than in the scientific empirical hypotheses to which they're connected. The ones we take seriously as underwriting the part of the metaphysics of science that we're interested in. The question then is whether we'll find our metaphysics of science credences to be high enough for belief. Either way, by unpacking those details of confirmation in warrant in particular cases, we may learn something about whether the epistemic conception of the aims of the metaphysics of science is a sensible one to have. Thanks a lot.